associate professor in the Israeli School of Architecture and Urbanism at Carleton University, where urbanism is something I hadn't seen before. Perhaps you can say something about it in relation to Lynne's work. Ben has an appreciation for all things architecture and has a profound appreciation of craft, and perhaps he will say something about that in his remarks as well. Guravich is the registrar at Olga Korper Gallery. That was Lynne's primary commercial gallery for many, many years. He's worked with Lynne and now working with the estate in cataloging and managing the works in the estate's collection and facilitating numerous traveling exhibitions of her work. Phyllis Lambert, we probably don't need to introduce. She will be joining us by a pre-recorded video from Europe. She's founding director of the Canadian Centre for Architecture and a longtime friend of Lynne and Andrew. She's widely recognized for her role in the realization of the Seagram building in New York, a building that's transformed the architecture not only in New York City, but throughout North America. Lynne, using a large format camera, fast film, long exposures, made pictures. What's remarkable about her work is the consistency of her subject matter, the consistency of the images she made. The built human environment is there. Diana called it this morning the engineered world. I like that. It's an environment devoid of the human body, although humanity is there. What's also remarkable in her work, and we heard much of this morning, is the humor that she drew from the ordinary. What I learned from Lynne's photographs was how to see what I was looking at. And I must say, I don't think I'll ever be able to look at a light switch, a plug-in, a radiator, or a vent in the way I used to do before looking at Lynne's pictures. I will always think of her when I see a crooked plug-in or a light switch that is in the middle of the wall where you want to hang art. We really do curious things about the environment in which we live. This panel is to focus on Lynne Cohen, A Singular Vision. Singular is a curious word. There are many dictionary definitions. I went through many of the dictionary definitions, and I thought that Merriam-Webster perhaps best reduced these many meanings to three concepts. The first concept of singular is showing or indicating no more than one thing. The second, better or greater than what is usual or normal. And the third, strange or odd. And I'd like to repeat that. Firstly, showing or indicating no more than one thing. Second, better or greater than what is usual or normal. And third, strange or odd. And these three concepts all modify Lynne's artistic vision to some greater or lesser extent. Her works show no more than one thing in focusing on the built environment devoid of the human body. There's no doubt that her vision was better or greater in framing the ordinary. And lastly, her photographs are both strange and odd, not strange or odd. Now I'd like to now turn to the panel and invite a panel to address Lynne's singular vision and to comment on the body of her work. And it's fortunate that we can start out with a video from Phyllis Lambert. I asked her whether I could convey some words to you to introduce the video, and I received from her an email this morning that says, "I very much regret that I could not be with you to celebrate the life and work of the great artist and dear friend, Lynne Cohen." Could we have the video?
Lynne Cohen. I'm intrigued by the persona and the artist, both of which I assume to be the same, to conflate. Novelists usually deny confluence between their lives and their stories. I want to know how Lynne made her choices, and so I wish to pursue Lynne's statement of 1983, in which she said, "My work is probably as much about my own biography as about the culture. They meet somewhere in between." One must assume that biography can do without indications of place at our time, for Lynne, by 1992, no longer dated her images, because she said, the photographs of the 70s were as relevant as those decades later. So that lets us off the hook of a biography built on chronology, but no longer identified subject and place. Beginning as a sculptor who was of the aesthetics of Oldenburg, Oschwanger, Chamberlain, and Judd, Lynne made welded steel sculptures using found car parts. She was intrigued by minimalism and modern industrial materials, and she specifically called out linoleum, plastic laminate, naugahyde, and fake wood. And she embraced the Duchampian ready-made. The idea of the ready-made and modern materials would be strongly present in her work as a photographer, which she began close to home in her native Midwest. Mobile Home Park, Ypsilanti, Michigan, which you see on the screen, is the first picture by Lynne that Richard Pear and I acquired for the CCA in 1979. It is immediately a work in which the absence of human life, as I quote, packed with humor, presence, and permeated by sadness and humor. Lynne said people have such a strong presence that were I to photograph them, what interests me, the strangeness of how things are, would fade into the background. She sees her photographs as full of life and touching on the human condition, on social justice. An inferred, implicit, oblique association with the human body is always discernible. For her, the stronger the better. Years later, Lynne felt that she had made a mistake about Duchamp, that she'd gotten his idea of the ready-made wrong. As I saw it, there are works of art out there, this is Lynne speaking, pieces of the world, that I was framing. Where I got Duchamp wrong, and I wasn't the only one, is in ignoring his attitude of aesthetic indifference. I saw my found installations as politically and aesthetically charged. By presenting the ordinary and objects non-hierarchically, Lynne wanted to convey something about how the world could be different. I'm not sure what she meant by that. But then she declared, unequivocally, I am not neutral about what I photograph. What is it that she chooses to look at closely, and why? First, and briefly, she made pictures in private homes that moved to working environments. This is already a biographical statement. She said, I'm interested in the look of places where people spend their time and what they do to them, and what places in turn do to the people who pass through them. Figure 2 is on the slide, is on the screen. In 1970s, she said, people's homes often freakishly matched up with pictures of home furnishing catalogs that she was drawn to. Lynne also liked the directness of postcards and pop art, with its aims to dissolve the boundaries between sacred and profane. And she continued to refer to artists, painters, mostly contemporaries, and also to the methods used to create the illusion of three-dimensionality by Renaissance and Baroque artists. Andrew Lugg told me that artistic life in the early 70s was rich in East Michigan, where Lynne taught, and nearby Ann Arbor, where Andrew was a student. It was an active center of experimental music, with visitors like John Cage, and there, Lynne heard a lecture by Walker Evans, which left a deep impression on her. The way Evans and Robert Frank worked, straightforward, transcendent, and real, was very important, and together with her friendship with the photographers Nick Nixon and John Schott, Lynne veered towards photography. And I must say that this was very much a reaction to the Family of Man exhibition with its sentimentality. With concentration and tremendous focus, looking long and hard from the outside, her choices of what to look at became interiors, places hidden from view. From reception rooms, spas, swimming pools, to places of surveillance, increasingly present from the late 1980s on. Looking for pictures was a big thing. Initially, she searched by driving around in her car, especially at night when interiors were illuminated, and she combed the yellow pages for sights. Lynne was always looking for the next picture, places of actual use in which photography is an artifice with no room for trickery. Although many of her photographs are weird, the details of scale, color, the light source, and the subject itself, with a sense of neutrality, Lynne's research was not for something odd, but something just a step from the everyday, not too far, not too near, just a step. Seeing things from the outside, the strangeness of how things are. Where does this come from? Earlier photographs were often thought of to be studio work, environments created by her, such as those by Thomas Demant. But unlike postmodernist approaches, Lynne would insist, I quote, "Since early on, I have gone with what is there. With what is there. I am interested in how I might capture wrongness, R-O-N-G-N-E-S-S. Much of this is achieved by the camera itself. As she explained, the large format camera makes things look stranger than they appear to the naked eye. It registers every blemish and adds a layer of seemingly objective neutrality. I don't fight against any of this. I exploit it." End of quote. She embraces wrongness of scale, and the wrongness inherent in using color film induced her to use it. Finding its inaccuracies, she emphasized, that's all to the good. They are not to be corrected, but embraced and highlighted. She enjoyed revealing uncanny space and life-sized objects that looked like models or toys. None of my places look real, but then again, not much appears real when you step back and take a look. Now, this is absolutely true. Try it yourself. It's one of my favorite games, just to look at wherever you are and see all the things that are a little strange, a little off. Can we assume that societal exchange played a role in the places Lynne chose to photograph? When Occupied Territories was published in 1987, it was concurrent with the economic crash of '86, the Contra Affair, Chernobyl, and the Unabomber. Since the 60s, Lynne was aware of a movement towards making art that was political and conceptual, but while her work bore on sharp edges of human frailty, it was not polemical. She states, "There are no extremes in my work, no political or social claim, and the geometric growth in surveillance from scientifically devised tests unseen by the observed, as you see in this entitled Climate Walls, and shooting ranges," in the next slide, increased in her work as it had politically subsuming the military in the 21st century. Lynne's work was non-extreme, non-judgmental. Police schools and military installations had interesting trappings, but uncovering the secret and the forbidden was of no interest to her. She liked that people do things in funny ways, that being how people are. Lynne said more than once that her work was more like Jacques Tati than Michel Foucault. Lynne talks much about neutrality. She titled an essay, more or less, The Anonymous, Deadpan, Uncontaminated, Then and Now. referring to 19th century photography of Spain. Putting subject matter to one side, Lynne focused on their formal strategies, the objective, unadorned, and transparent nature of their work, with which she shared strategies. Artists to produce photographs with an aura of neutrality, albeit acceptable. In effect, the phenomenon of neutrality is endemic to the work of the great pioneering photographers of the 1850s and 60s. A century later, this was intimated in the Discourse on Modern Photography by John Sikorsky's exhibition, New Documents of 1967, which included the work of Gary Winograd, Leif Friedlander, and Diane Arbus. This redirected documentary photography to more personal ends, photography that emphasized the complexities and conflicts of modern life, all presented without editorializing or sentimentalizing, but with a critical, observant eye. The new topographics exhibition at Eastman House in 1957 included Lynne's contemporaries, among them Louis Boltz, Frank Goldke, Nicholas Nixon, Stephen Shore. Incidentally, or not so incidentally, they were photographers of the 1974-78 photographic commission that I initiated for the U.S. Bicentennial, titled Courthouse, a photographic document, and it was edited by Richard Baer. Like Lynne's work, but unknown to us, we insisted on the use of few cameras. Louis Boltz was the only exception, and except for Stephen Shore, all photographs are black and white. Neutrality was arrived at consciously by Lynne, who spoke of aiming for a kind of deceptive neutrality, although the subject of her photographs is scarcely neutral. She achieved this by photographing at a somewhat neutral distance and by employing particular formal devices: flat lighting, deep focus, symmetry, and neutral distance in a straightforward manner. This permitted her to address complicated themes, ones, she said, that might creep up on the viewer subliminally rather than hitting them over the head. Her hope was that the quieter, more understated, even anonymous look of her pictures, the more compelling the hidden commentary might be. Abstraction also played a big role. By abstraction, Lynne meant that which tells you nothing about what the thing is, such as marks left by the skaters on skating rinks that she photographed and the marks on linoleum floors of her banquet hall pictures. Like Jackson Pollock paintings, she said, it is as if the traces are records of all that has gone on. Wondering how it is that sometimes a record becomes more an abstraction than a document, Lynne found the scale plays a role, especially so in large-scale, mostly colored photographs that she begins making after 2009. She felt that large scale also enhances the formal qualities of her pictures and allows the viewer to almost get inside. Like Baroque painting, the viewer is engaged physically and psychologically. Lynne started using color film in the late 1990s, intrigued by the possibility that something unexpected could happen in using it. But she very much liked black and white, not least because it leaves a lot for the viewer to fill in. This, to her, was crucial. Talking of early Spanish photographs in 2012, Lynne was eloquent about the relationship of viewer and the work of art, which goes hand in hand with neutrality. There is, I think, something more egalitarian about allowing things to speak for themselves, about inviting viewers with their personal histories and baggage to enter into and contribute something of their own. Actually, this fits well with the picture I have of art as a back and forth relationship, a kind of dialectical process involving the world, the artist, the artwork, and the viewer. I would like to think that something like this goes with my work. And that, for me, Phyllis, the superb craftsmanship, the refusal of piety, the humor, the cues askew, and the view of the strangeness of things. Thank you.
And that's a tough act to follow. But now we've had one architectural view. Perhaps we can have another architectural view of the singular vision of Lynne Cohen.
Indeed, I thought they just invited me because I'm the architect, and then I realized that Phyllis Lambert is on the agenda as well. So, but it was interesting, I should say, and for me, conspicuous this morning that the word architecture never came up at all, which I think is fantastic because it makes one of the points that I'd like to make, which is that good art throws off all kinds of interpretations. Anyway. I think I'm here to sort of represent Lynne's work from the architectural point of view. I wanted to start off by, first of all, noting that I'm going to be engaging in a little bit of a philosophical meditation today. Now, most of it is written, but I'm going to ad-lib here at the beginning because when I say philosophical meditation, it's not only about me and my vision or excitement about Lynne Cohen's work, but inevitably it involves Andrew. Glen mentioned that Andrew had edited Phyllis Lambert's script, and indeed I sent my work to Andrew on Lynne's work to edit as well, and so Andrew was always there in some ways. So I thought it would be appropriate to start with this image. This looks like a Lynne Cohen. In fact, it looks like a Lynne Cohen environment, but indeed it's a picture of Wittgenstein's house. It's a picture of the house that I should say that Wittgenstein designed for his sister, and Andrew can correct me, I think this is the same sister that Gustav Klimt painted, so if you can imagine the incredible difference in the sensibility of Klimt's painting of the sister and this house that was designed by the brother for the sister. I can't imagine the sister did anything except, did she even live there, Andrew?
Yes, but it wasn't the same.
It wasn't the same sister. Oh well, there goes the story. So
they were the same social class.
That's right.
They looked the same way.
But this is the same milieu of Vienna that Hunt is working in as well. Andrew, as you know, is a Wittgenstein scholar. Not only did Lynne teach here at Ottawa, but Andrew was here for years and years in the Department of Philosophy. And as Lynne went around the world producing work and talking about her work, Andrew continued to work away on Wittgenstein, and to some degree these two things sort of meld in my own mind. The work I'm going to talk about today, and I will get to it, was actually written for a conference in Cambridge, so I thought this is appropriate. Here I am sitting in Cambridge, which is where Wittgenstein was and did most of his work, and I'm emailing Andrew back and forth saying, what do you think of what I'm going to say about Lynne? And so there's this nice kind of symmetry to it all. I think when I first saw Lynne's work, I recognized it already, and I think it was really only today that I realized what I recognized was these images of Wittgenstein's house that I had seen years ago when I was in architecture school, and there was a certain sensibility there. And so many of the things that have been talked about with Lynne today, this kind of obsession with doorknobs and sort of strange things, the radiator too. I mean, Wittgenstein spent an inordinate amount of time in his sister's house designing the radiators, which, odd, who cares? And these images of the house, I mean, I kept looking at them as an architecture student saying, but where's the architecture? But where's the architecture? And you just can't find it there at all. Whatever Wittgenstein was interested in, it didn't follow the normal terms of reference that one might associate with architecture. So with that, I'll head into the text, saying this is as much an homage to Andrew and Lynne as it is to Lynne. So whatever else we might accomplish with this presentation, my goal, I like this name by the way, room for interpretation. Okay. Whatever else we might accomplish with this presentation, my goal is to expose you to as much of Lynne Cohen's work as possible. So I plan to cycle through about 30 images, and While this is going on behind me, I'll make a few observations. Instead of using images of Cohen's work to demonstrate a particular point, my remarks are intended as a kind of backdrop to her work. There are numerous ways to discuss an artist's work. We can talk about the artist herself, highlighting biographical details, identifying influences. We can discuss the work itself, whether individual pieces or the opus as a whole. Thirdly, we can place the work in a cultural and art historical context, comparing it to others or larger shifts in our understanding of representation, or we can expound on issues and ideas that the work raises. For this presentation, I've chosen to do a bit of all of the above, but mostly just to meditate on why I find Lynne Cohen's work so compelling. And many of my observations will resonate with points that have been raised by others already today, and I apologize in advance if the comments tend toward the ponderous. While Lynne Cohen photographed architecture, she was by no means an architectural photographer. I should clarify that the conference in Cambridge was a conference on architectural photography. So Lynne was by no means an architectural photographer, nor arguably was architecture her subject matter. By and large, she used architecture as a frame to explore the power of the frame to evoke meaning. As an architect, I have both a default appreciation for things architectural and a profound appreciation for craft. Because Lynne Cohen produced exceptionally well-crafted images of architectural settings, it's perhaps not surprising that I find her work so absorbing. It's at this point, however, that things get interesting. While Cohen photographed architecture, it would be misleading to categorize her as an architectural photographer. Nor is it clear that the environments she photographed either aspire or attain to the category of architecture. In Cohen's work, it's ambiguous whether architecture is the focus or merely the setting. Good art throws off multiple interpretations, especially art in which subject matter is, in the words of 19th century historian Alice Riegel, less quote-unquote self-contained. Lynne Cohen's work is captivating precisely because it's, are those scrolling automatically? Okay.
Yes.
You probably shouldn't be. Anyway, hopefully we'll end on the right side at the right time. Yeah, I think for some reason when we loaded it onto the machine, it got set on auto scroll. But because I'm not pressing the button. You said you didn't think I was. I think somebody had this problem earlier. Right? Anyway, there we go. Okay. Yeah, so Lynne Cohen's work is captivating precisely because it's so open-ended and accepting of interpretation. The apparent absence of subject matter in her images raises virtually everything, even the most apparently insignificant details, to the level of potential subject matter. Indeed, the extent of its openness to interpretation is in direct proportion to both the paucity and the problematic character of the elements which she pointed her lens. Cohen's work is exceedingly spare without being ascetic, in a literal sense, and here images leave a lot of room for interpretation. Okay. No, we went way too far. Okay, we're supposed to be looking at Robert Gover. He was back there somewhere?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know what's going on. There we are. Okay, yes, thank you very much. Now I'll take it from here, so hopefully it'll work. In art, human subjects constitute subject matter. According to Riegel, the presence of the human subject in the work of art is what differentiates fine art from applied art, or at least it did until the end of the 19th century. And this is why ornamental motifs rarely contain human figures, and why Riegel considered ancient Egyptian art, which mixed representation, ornament, and pictographic writing, to be imperfect by more evolved Western standards. Creeping as it did in and out of the frame and over surfaces and structural elements, Riegel opined that the subject matter of Egyptian art was too abstract to be effectively embodied. Ornament, burdened by subject matter, cannot perform its semiotic function properly, nor can fine art attain its potential when it's improperly framed. It's perhaps for this reason that we find the emotionally charged subject matter in Robert Gobert's wallpaper so disturbing. Lynching is not the stuff of wallpaper, or of any ornament for that matter. Conversely, if the human figure does not appear in a work of fine art, what is there to differentiate it from applied art, or from ornament, or, in the case of photography, from mere documentation? Fine art's break with the figure was the basis of Kandinsky's concern that, at the limit, his canvases might be dismissed as compositions, or worse, be mistaken for silk tie patterns. In Cohen's work, the human figure is conspicuously absent. Arguably, then, the absence challenges her image's status as works of art. And yet, by framing this conspicuous emptiness, first by the lens and then by architecture, the artist, is it still scrolling?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not pressing it, so I'm going to give up. So what happens will happen there, but somewhere along the line you'll see a John Baltasari image that's important. Okay, so yes. And by framing these conspicuous emptiness, first by the lens and then by architecture, the artist provokes the viewer to fill these ambiguous voids with meaning in order to elevate her images to the works of art that we recognize them to be. Photographers, like architects, understand the power of the frame. It's within the purview of the frame to elevate empty spaces into the category of places and in turn objects, indiscriminate and random as they might be, into subjects. And here we recognize something of the nuanced relationship between ourselves, others, and our objects of perception. While an object is independent of us, a subject is not. Subjects are objects that have been subjected to contemplation, having been brought to our attention or otherwise penetrated our consciousness through the senses. The objects that we apprehend visually are unique to the extent that they remain detached and independent of us, unlike, for example, things that we apprehend through touch or smell or taste. In his philosophy of fine arts, there's the Baltasari. In his philosophy of fine arts, Hegel addresses architecture's limitations as an art form. Hegel notes that architecture, as a mode of artistic expression, predated representation, and as such, was unable to embody meaning in any articulate manner. Not surprising then, Hegel lumps architecture and Egyptian art together into the realm of abstraction. Having seemed to dismiss it, however, he goes on to posit that architecture is actually the precondition of art, art being the medium through which the idea or meaning takes form. Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong in these points. He's already done this, so it's okay. Hegel speculates that architecture's primary function with respect to art is to create the frame, whether in the form of a temple or an altar, or any boundary erected to distinguish one plot or precinct as different, more sacred, or otherwise more meaningful than any other. Rather than suggesting that architecture is, quote, merely the frame, however, Hegel understands that this frame is powerfully instrumental. The act of differentiating things and places from one another is what brings them into being and imbues them with qualities. In this regard, architectural frame, or the architecture as frame, is the midwife of meaning. And here we acknowledge a fundamental affinity between architecture and photography, namely its capacity to frame, and in so doing to evoke meaning, or produce meaning. In this respect, photography is tantamount to architecture relieved of all the functions that we associate with mere buildings. It is architecture reduced to pure framing. And it would seem then that architectural photography is a particularly privileged subset of photography, one that is potentially rhetorical, inasmuch as the architectural photographer frames the frame. And it's interesting to consider that in framing, Lynne Cohen not only imbued empty spaces of mundane buildings with meaning, however elusive, but elevated these buildings to the realm of architecture by transforming spaces into places. It's as if the environments that she presents us are prosthetically enhanced, are shored up and emboldened by the photographer's frame. Unable to be reduced to the absence of figures or a dearth of action then, Cohen's spaces emerge as voids pregnant with possibility. They become significant places full of significant things. One might characterize this as the semiotics of framing, namely the ability of a structural or syntactic element, like the frame, to produce a powerful semantic effect, and to some degree independent of the things or lack of things that appear in that frame. And while in more conventional scenes or tableaus, this meaning might adhere to a more or less cohesive narrative or to a particularly beautiful object or view, in Cohen's work, the meaning is fundamentally detached. It roams around the scene at an accelerating state of panic. Detached from any obvious narrative and unable to take form, meaning becomes a form of anxiety. It's as if the photographer has trapped meaning in a place that it clearly has no place being, and then asked it to make account of itself. Meaning, in response, attaches to and to some degree hides behind whatever it can find. It's important to note that the scenes that Cohen photographs, and here I use present tense, I'm sorry, are found environments, that they are not staged. I know Andrew was correcting me, but rather are spaces and collections of things upon which the photographer happened. Having identified her subject, she captured the scene largely, she found it, I know it's largely is the arbitrary word here. The ad hoc and spontaneous quality of these so-called found environments, however, is in direct contrast to the time and the care and the technical expertise that was required to capture them. So while the scene is not staged, so to speak, the photograph is. And again, meaning is produced, the meaning produced is in direct proportion to the gap between the randomness of the scene and the deliberation and technical expertise required to capture it. In such a context, it would be arguably disingenuous to include human figures. Moreover, the process virtually precludes it. The temporality in which human beings exist would prevent their presence in Lynne Cohen's lens. Spontaneity implies something quite different to human subjects than to collections of inanimate objects. Not only would the appearance of human beings have to be staged, which runs counter to the artist's aesthetics of authenticity, but arguably they would steal the show. Human subjects are thus much more powerful in their absence than they could ever be were they to actually appear in person. And this resonates with the work of another artist, namely John Baltasari, whose image you saw. In his so-called, I wonder if you, yeah, probably never. Sorry, it's a little, that's okay. This resonates with the work of another artist, namely John Baltasari. His so-called dot paintings. Baltasari presents us with human subjects not, only to hide their identity, and in so doing, he prevents them from fulfilling their preemptive role as subject matter, and he deflects attention onto the setting, which oftentimes he also obscures. It leaves the viewer struggling to get a footing. Baltasari deflects us from one subject to another, drawing attention to both through the act of obscuring. One might juxtapose one of Baltasari's dot paintings with one of my favorite images by Cohen, using the circular forms and flat planes of the color as a point of connection. It's that great image of it's called Red Door, it's the red wall with the carpet with the dots, so it's like the Baltasari dots kind of, I don't know. When you put those two together, it just sings. So Baltasari's subjects face us, but their faces are covered. In Cohen's image, the subjects also face us, but they appear to be missing. Again, we're deflected to the context, which, in the absence of subjects, and in response to the gaze of the camera, attempts to rise itself to the status of subject matter. But it's not so simple. While the figures we might expect to be present are missing, the scene is not empty. And this brings us to another theme in Cohen's work, namely the idea of stand-ins or surrogates. In many of the photographer's works, chairs appear to stand in for the missing human subjects. And not only do humans sit in chairs, but chairs sit, like humans, in rooms. And moreover, the chair is so tied to the form of the human body that it's virtually impossible not to anthropomorphize these objects. In both their generic form and their specific qualities, we cannot help but empathize with these objects, especially as they appear to be addressing us. The presence of furniture in Cohen's work, often explicitly domestic furniture in explicitly institutional settings, plays to our need to turn objects into subjects in an effort to find subject matter where it appears to be missing. In this regard, the artist seems to be helping, or at the very least cognizant of our dilemma. But surrogates in Lynne Cohen's work take a number of forms. At the more literal end of the scale, there are recognizable figures like silhouettes and body parts and 2D cutouts and mannequins and actually photographs, but they can also be potted plants, taxidermical specimens, or a combination thereof. Whatever gets caught in the lens, in effect, becomes subject matter or inadvertently raised to the level of subject matter. And this raises yet another theme in Cohen's work, namely the play between two-dimensional and the second and the third dimension. Like the dots in the untitled Ren door, which are simultaneously two-dimensional in the case of the rug and three-dimensional in the case of the tabletop, Cohen explores the ambiguity of dimensionality in photography. While most image capture technologies flatten three-dimensional objects by projecting them onto a two-dimensional plane, Cohen leverages this blurred dimensionality to re-dimensionalize the two-dimensional images that she captures. As such, images and objects have equal and very ambiguous status in many of Cohen's works. This ambiguity is especially compelling in images such as Men's Club and Showroom, which I should be able to show you, where graphics and photographs bend around different three-dimensional planes and where two-dimensional objects challenge the actual dimensionality of the room. Finally, circling back on several of the things we've already raised, you may have noticed that Cohen has a particular affinity for lobbies and waiting rooms. Such spaces are arguably metaphoric for the works themselves. The vacant chairs in these provisional spaces, in other words, spaces whose meaning or function differs to a more significant space outside or beyond them, appear to be poised and waiting for human subjects. So it's the waiting room waiting for human subjects, who in turn will sit or have recently sat in these rooms to wait. Assuming the figure has yet to arrive, the action then is twice removed in time and at least once removed in space. The action, such as it is, was, or might sometime be, elsewhere, leaving the props to keep the spectators occupied in the interim. In discussing the shift toward modernity that was taken by Dutch art in the 16th century, art historian Michael Podro describes the movement from the self-contained subject matter, in other words, a painting where all the action is kind of focused in, to the depiction of figures that attend to speech or action taking place outside the camera. One of the images that we'll cycle through was an image actually of Rembrandt's, one of his anatomy lessons, where there is action in the image, but some of the people aren't paying attention to the action in the image. They're looking out and engaging with the subject itself. So it's painting breaking from the self-contained narrative and entering the space of the viewer, directly engaging the viewer. This is particularly poignant when the gaze of the depicted subject extends out of the canvas to engage the viewer, rather than being cast as a spectator of a self-cohesive, action-oriented narrative. Then the viewer beholds a quote-unquote attentive subject, and recognizing himself in this attentive individual, the viewer also senses himself to be recognized by it. In other words, the viewer looking out of the painting is also, in some ways, the equivalent of the viewer looking at the painting. And so when you see somebody looking at you, you recognize that you're looking at them. And in the process, the figure transmutes itself from an object into a subject. By both recognizing and feeling himself to be recognized, the viewer is drawn into the space of the canvas and raised to a state of self-consciousness. And Hegel saw this elevation from consciousness to self-consciousness as the highest function of art. Cohen plays with exactly this phenomenon in her work, which is both arrestingly bereft of action and irreducible to a single narrative. Recalling the figures in the anatomy lesson, inanimate objects appear to be anticipating or attending to activity occurring outside of the subject, displaced in either time or space or both. As viewers, we find ourselves empathizing with the empty chairs in vacant anterooms as we become aware of waiting. And in the process, we're drawn into the frame. Becoming conscious of our attempt to make meaning, we're raised to a level of self-consciousness. As such, Cohen's work humorously parodies the quote-unquote meaning effect to which great works of art subject us. Subversive in her understatement, Cohen is a master provocateur. But by denying access to anything that is readily recognizable as subject matter, the artist provokes us. Her images challenge us to make sense of what we're seeing, casting us into the role of makers. Lynne Cohen's images invite us into the frame, blurring the role of spectator, artist, subject, and object, and, if you will, blurring the roles of boundaries between photographer and architect. Framing the marginal, she elevates objects into subjects, spaces into places, and mere buildings into sentient works of architecture. Thank you very much.